The stagecoach bucked and rattled over the last of the rugged plains, its wheels churning up a fine, ochre-colored dust that coated everything in a gritty film. Inside, Clara Wynne sat bone-straight on the cracked leather seat, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white as bleached bone. She did not look at the other passengers. A whiskey-breathed salesman and a tired-looking woman with 2 fretful children. For 3 days, she had been a ghost in their midst, a silent figure in a gray, travel-worn dress, her face hidden by the brim of a plain bonnet. Her world had been reduced to the contents of the tattered suitcase at her feet and the single, folded document in her pocket. The paper was a promise, a legal thing that felt as fragile as a dried leaf. It was a marriage license, bearing her name and that of a man she had never met, Ephraim Coulter. His letters had been brief, practical, written in a rough but steady hand. He was a widower. He'd said he owned a small ranch outside a Wyoming town called Clay Ridge. He needed a wife, and she, in her own quiet desperation, needed a place to disappear, a place so far from the damp, shadowed streets of Philadelphia that no memory, no ghost, could ever follow. When the coach finally groaned to a halt, the salesman let out a whoop and shoved his way out into the blinding sunlight. Clara waited, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, until the coach was empty. She stepped down onto the hard-packed earth of what passed for a main street. Clay Ridge was not a town so much as a wound in the landscape, a single muddy street, flanked by a dozen or so raw timber buildings, all looking temporary, as if they might be swept away by the ceaseless wind that tore across the high prairie. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge belching black smoke, and a sheriff's office with a sagging porch. Men with faces caked in dust and suspicion stopped to stare. Their eyes lingered on her. A lone woman, a stranger. It was a look she knew too well, a look that stripped a person down to their use. She pulled her thin shawl tighter and clutched the handle of her suitcase, waiting for a man who was supposed to change her life. Instead, a man with a tin star pinned to his vest approached. He was tall and thick-shouldered, with a graying beard that could not hide the grim set of his mouth. "You'd be Miss Wynne?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of welcome. "I am," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. "I am here to meet Mr. Ephraim Coulter." The sheriff's eyes, the color of slate, flickered over her, then to the silent, watching faces in the street. "There's been some trouble. Miss, you'd best come with me." He led her not to a buggy, not to a waiting gentleman, but to the jailhouse. The air inside was cold and smelled of stale sweat and old wood smoke. He gestured to a hard wooden bench. "Sit." Clara sat, her legs trembling. The hope that had been a tiny, flickering candle flame within her for 1,000 miles began to gutter. "What trouble, Sheriff? Is Mr. Coulter unwell?" The man, Sheriff Hart, leaned against his desk, crossing his thick arms. "Mr. Coulter is dead." The words did not seem to register at first. They were just sounds, hanging in the cold air. Dead. A man she had pinned her entire existence to. A man whose face she had tried to imagine 100 times, was gone before she had even arrived. "His cabin was found burned this morning," the sheriff continued, his tone methodical, as if reading from a report. "What was left of him was inside. Throat was cut." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. A violent nausea churned in her stomach. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows in the corners deepening. Burned. The smell of smoke and something else, something sickeningly sweet, filled her memory. A phantom scent from a past she had run from. "Folks are spooked," Sheriff Hart said. His eyes narrowed on her face, watching her reaction with a cold, professional curiosity. Coulter was a hard man, had his share of enemies, but this is different, and it strikes some as mighty peculiar that his mail-order bride shows up the very next day. The accusation was not spoken, but it hung between them, thick and suffocating. She was the catalyst, the strange woman from back east whose arrival coincided with fire and blood. She could feel the weight of the town's suspicion settling on her shoulders like a shroud. I did not know him, she stammered, the words catching in her throat. I only had his letters. I'll need to see those letters and your effects. He did not ask. It was a command. He took her suitcase and her reticule, dumping their meager contents onto his desk. A spare dress, a brush, a small, worn Bible, and the folded marriage license. He picked up the license, turning it over in his calloused hands. All legal and proper, makes things complicated. Complicated how? She whispered. His property, debts. You were set to be his wife, by law. That might make you his heir, he grunted. Or it might make you someone with a reason to want him out of the way. The injustice of it was a bitter pill. She had traveled across a continent to escape condemnation, only to find it waiting for her, a fresh and terrible vintage. Shame, hot and familiar, washed over her. It did not matter that she was innocent. In her life, accusation had always been the same as guilt. For your own protection, the sheriff said, his voice taking on a tone of false solicitude. I'm going to have to ask you to stay here for a while. In a cell, just until we can sort this out and quiet the talk. He led her to a small, barred room at the back of the building. It contained a narrow cot with a filthy blanket and a bucket in the corner. The lock turning in the heavy iron door was a sound she knew with an intimacy that made her soul ache. The metallic click echoed the sound of her bedroom door back home. The final, dreadful sound before the silence and the darkness descended. Humiliation was a cold, familiar companion. She sank onto the cot, wrapping her arms around herself. And for the first time since her mother's death, Clara Wynne wept. She spent 2 days in that cell. The sounds of Clay Ridge filtered through the single, grimy window. Men's rough laughter from the saloon, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the incessant, whining cry of the wind. Women from the town brought her meals, plates of beans and stale bread left on the floor without a word, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and contempt. Clara ate what she could, forcing the tasteless food down, knowing that survival was an act of defiance. On the 3rd day, the door to the outer office opened and closed, followed by the low murmur of men's voices. One voice was Sheriff Hart's. The other was different. It was a low, quiet rumble, a voice that seemed unused to speaking. "You've got no cause to hold her, Hart," the quiet voice said. "I've got every cause," the sheriff countered. "She's a stranger. Coulter's dead. The town's on edge. It's for her own good." "You call a cage good?" There was a pause. "Coulter was my captain during the war. I owed him. I won't see his intended bride treated like a criminal because you're too lazy to find the real trouble." There was a scrape of a chair, then heavy footsteps. A man appeared at her cell door, standing just behind the sheriff. He was tall and lean, built of sinew and bone, and he moved with a stillness that was unnerving. His face was all sharp angles, weathered by sun and hardship. A network of old burn scars crept up from the collar of his shirt, twisting along his jawline and the side of his neck. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they looked at her with an unnerving intensity, as if he saw not just a woman in a cell, but the very shape of her fear. "This is Levi Boone," the sheriff said, his voice tight with irritation. "He worked for Coulter a while back. Thinks he knows better than the law." Levi Boone's gaze did not waver. He ignored the sheriff completely, his attention fixed on her. "You can't stay here," he said. The words were not a question, not an offer, but a statement of fact. "And where do you propose she go?" "Boone?" Sheriff Hart sneered. "The hotel won't take her. No decent family will." "She can stay with me," Levi said, the words falling into the silence like stones. "I've got a shack and a barn. She can have the barn." The sheriff laughed. A short, ugly sound. "A lone woman in your barn? The gossips will have a field day with that." "Let them," Levi said, his voice dropping even lower, carrying a hint of something dangerous. "It's better than this." He looked back at Clara. "Well?" Clara stared at him, her mind racing. This man was a stranger, as much as Ephraim Coulter had been. He was silent and intense, and the scars on his face spoke of a violence she could only imagine. Every instinct, honed by years of her stepfather's cruelty, told her to recoil from such a man. Men who were quiet were often the most dangerous. Their anger simmered beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. And yet, what choice did she have? To stay in this cell, to be gawked at and judged, was a slow death of the spirit. His offer was not kind, not gentle. It was stark and practical. A barn. It was shelter. It was not a cage. "I will go," she said, her voice thin but clear. Sheriff Hart, seeing he was beaten, grumbled and unlocked the door. He shoved her suitcase into her hands. "Don't you leave the territory, Miss. I'm not done with my investigation." Levi Boone turned without another word and walked out. Clara followed him, her steps uncertain, into the hostile sunlight of the main street. He did not slow for her, did not look back. He simply walked, and she had to hurry to keep pace. He led her away from the center of town, past the last of the ramshackle houses, and out onto the open prairie where the wind blew without mercy. The silence between them was vast and heavy. Clara, accustomed to filling silences to appease a volatile temper, found herself adrift. This man demanded nothing. His silence was not menacing, not expectant. It was simply empty. A part of him. It made her more nervous than shouting would have. She watched the straight, tense line of his back, the way he moved with a grim economy of motion. He was a closed door, locked and bolted. His home was a small, crudely built shack that seemed to be barely holding its own against the wind. Nearby stood a barn, leaning slightly, its wood weathered to a silver gray. He gestured toward it with his chin. "That's it," he said. He led her inside. The barn was cool and dark, smelling of hay and horse and dry earth. Light filtered through cracks in the walls. A few stalls lined one side. 2 horses shifted and snorted softly at their arrival. In a clean-swept corner, there was a pile of fresh straw. "You can sleep there," he said, pointing. "There's a well out back for water. The privy is behind the shack. I'll bring you food later." He turned to leave. "Mr. Boone!" she called out, the words escaping before she could stop them. He paused in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the bright, harsh light. "Why?" He stood there for a long moment, his back to her. "I owed Coulter," he said finally, without turning around, "and no one belongs in a cage." Then he was gone. Clara sank onto the straw, the suitcase dropping from her numb fingers. A barn. She was to live in a barn, at the mercy of another silent, scarred man. But as the fear subsided, a different feeling took its place. The straw was clean, the air was fresh, and there was no lock on the door. For the first time in days, she could breathe. Over the next week, a strange, silent routine established itself. Levi would leave before dawn and return after dusk, his clothes covered in the dust of the range. He would leave a plate of food for her on a crate outside the barn door, usually jerky and biscuits, sometimes a piece of salted pork he had cooked over his fire. He never tried to speak to her, never entered the barn while she was in it. Clara, in turn, began to impose a small order on her new world. She swept the barn floor until it was immaculate. She found an old bucket and scrubbed it clean for washing. During the long days, she would venture out, exploring the immediate area around the shack, though she never went far. She discovered that Ephraim Coulter had not been a well-liked man. Overhearing snippets of conversation when Levi took her into town for supplies, a tense, silent affair where she felt the burn of every stare. She pieced together a fractured portrait of her dead fiancé. He was a man drowning in debts, a man who had made enemies with a cattle baron named Matheson, and she learned he owned a tract of land somewhere far from town, a wild, unclaimed piece of territory that no one ever visited. She tried to keep her distance from Levi Boone, to remain as unobtrusive as the mice in the hayloft, but his presence was a constant, powerful force. At night, she would lie in her straw bed and watch the flicker of his fire through the cracks in the barn wall. Sometimes, she would hear him cry out in his sleep, not words, but sharp, guttural sounds of pure agony. The sounds would slice through the quiet of the prairie night, and Clara would lie awake, her own heart pounding in sympathetic terror. She knew the landscape of nightmares. Her own were filled with the heavy scent of whiskey and the sound of her stepfather's belt buckle striking the floor. She recognized the same hauntedness in him, a brokenness that mirrored her own. One evening, as she sat just inside the barn door, mending a tear in her dress, she saw him return. He moved stiffly, his left side rigid with pain. As he dismounted, he stumbled, catching himself against his horse. His face, illuminated by the setting sun, was a mask of agony. He saw her watching and straightened immediately, his expression becoming a blank wall. But she had seen it, the pain, the effort it took him to simply exist. Levi avoided touch with a fierceness that bordered on panic. When he handed her a sack of flour in town, his fingers brushed hers, and he recoiled as if he had been burned. Clara understood. Touch, for her, had always been a prelude to pain. It was a currency of power, a violation. Seeing his aversion, she felt a strange kinship with him. He was a man walled off from the world, just as she was. Their life was a pantomime of domesticity, stripped of all warmth and connection. She began to cook for them both, using the small fire pit outside. It felt better than taking his silent offerings of cold food. She would leave a plate for him by his door, and he would leave the clean plate in the same spot the next morning. They communicated through these small, silent gestures. A clean plate, a neatly folded blanket she had washed in the well, a bucket of fresh water he left for her. They were two planets in a fixed, silent orbit, revolving around a shared core of pain. One night, the wind howled with a particular fury, rattling the old barn and making the timbers groan. It was a cold night, the kind that promised an early winter. Clara could not sleep. She sat huddled in her blanket, watching the light from Levi's fire dance and leap. She could see him through the largest crack in the wall. He was sitting on a log, staring into the flames, his back to her. She had been there for weeks, living in his shadow, and she knew almost nothing about him, save for what she could observe: the scars, the nightmares, the profound, unbreachable sorrow in his eyes. He was a mystery, a man made of silence and pain. Clara pulled her blanket tighter and continued to watch. He did not move for what felt like hours. He just sat there, a solitary figure against the vast, dark emptiness of the plains. The firelight played over the sharp lines of his face, casting his scars into deep relief. He looked like a man who had been to war, not just with others, but with himself, and had lost. She thought of the man she was supposed to marry, a man now buried in the cold Wyoming earth. She thought of the life she had imagined, a quiet life of peace and simple duties. It had all burned to ash, just like Ephraim Coulter's cabin. Now she was here, in a barn, living beside a ghost. And as she watched him, she realized that she, too, was a ghost, a phantom who had drifted from one broken life to another, invisible, unheard. He turned his head slightly, as if he could feel her watching him, but his eyes remained fixed on the fire, in the flickering light, in the howling of the wind. They sat apart, surrounded by an ocean of unspoken grief. Two ghosts breathing in the same cold, lonely air, 100 yards and 1,000 miles apart. The days bled one into the next, measured not by a calendar but by the slow, deliberate work of hands. Clara found a rhythm in the desolation, a purpose that was as vital and hard-won as breath itself. She discovered a small cache of Ephraim Coulter's old things in a forgotten crate in the barn. Work shirts worn thin at the elbows, trousers with patched knees. With a needle and thread from her own suitcase, she began to mend them. The simple act of pulling thread through worn fabric, of closing a hole and making something whole again, was a quiet solace. She worked until her fingers were sore, her mind focused on the small, manageable task, a welcome respite from the vast, unmanageable grief that was her life. Outside the barn, in a small patch of earth protected from the worst of the wind by the side of the shack, she began to dig. The ground was hard and stingy, full of rocks and stubborn roots. Using a rusted trowel she had found, she broke the soil, her palms blistering. She had a few seeds, saved from her mother's garden long ago, tucked away in a small envelope. She planted them with a desperate prayer, tending the small plot each day, carrying water from the well. They were meager greens, hardy and unassuming, but the sight of the first tiny leaves pushing their way toward the sun felt like a miracle. It was a sign that life, however fragile, insisted on returning. Levi watched her efforts from a distance. When he rode into town for supplies, his trips became more pointed. He saw the way the other ranchers and townsfolk looked at her when she accompanied him, their faces hardening into masks of judgment. He heard the whispers that coiled in the air behind her like snakes in the dust. The women would pull their children closer, their lips thin with disapproval. Men would stop talking when she passed, their silence a condemnation, and some would turn and spit tobacco juice into the dirt, a gesture of profound contempt. He saw it all, and a cold, familiar anger settled deep in his gut. He bought her a new bonnet, one with a wider brim to shield her face, and a fresh sack of flour, leaving them by the barn door without a word. Clara's days were filled with work, but her nights were long and haunted. The past was not a distant country. It was a room she was forced to enter every time she closed her eyes. She would be a child again, in the small, damp house in Philadelphia. She could smell the decay on the air, the cloying scent of consumption that clung to the bedding and the curtains. She saw her mother, a woman who had once been beautiful, now whittled down to a pale, skeletal wraith, her breath a shallow, rattling whisper. Her mother's hands, so thin they were almost translucent, would reach for her. "Be good, Clara," she would rasp. "Be quiet. Do not provoke him." And then her stepfather would come home. The heavy, confident tread of his boots on the floorboards was the sound of impending doom. He smelled of whiskey and the damp wool of his coat. He would look at Clara with eyes that were both empty and full of a terrible need. After her mother's last, ragged breath had faded into the silence of the room. The nights had become unbearable. She remembered one winter night, the snow falling thick and silent outside her window. He had been drinking more than usual. The look in his eye was different, darker. She had waited until the house was still, until his snores echoed in the hallway. And she had run. She had not stopped for shoes or a coat. She had run out into the blizzard, her bare feet burning with the cold, the snow like 1,000 tiny knives against her skin. She had made it 3 blocks before a neighbor found her, a small, shivering ghost in the swirling white, and dragged her back. The punishment that followed had been a lesson in the futility of escape. Levi's own nights were no more peaceful. His nightmares grew in intensity, fueled by a past he could not outrun. They were always the same: the roar of cannon fire, the screams of men and horses, the suffocating, acrid smell of smoke, and always, at the heart of the dream, there was a fire. Not the clean, contained fire of a hearth, but a wild, devouring inferno. He would see flames licking at dry timber, hear a woman scream swallowed by the roar. He would wake up gasping, his body drenched in sweat, the scars on his neck and jaw pulled tight, phantom heat searing his skin. One night, the dream was worse than ever. He was back in the war, men falling around him, the air thick with blood and gunpowder. Then the scene shifted, and he was standing before a burning barn, the heat blistering his face, the screams tearing at his soul. He thrashed in his narrow bunk, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He flung himself out of the bed, stumbling into the small, dark space of the shack, and collapsed to his knees, his hands covering his head as if to ward off a physical blow. Clara heard the crash. She had been lying awake, listening to the lonely cry of a coyote, and the sound from the shack sent a jolt of fear through her. She waited, her body tense, expecting shouting, expecting violence. But there was only a ragged, desperate gasping for air. Cautiously, she crept to the barn door and peered out. Through the open doorway of the shack, she could see his silhouette on the floor, a dark, crumpled shape against the dying orange glow of the embers in the hearth. He was on his knees, his whole body shaking. A war raged within her. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to lock the barn door, to hide. A man in such a state was a dangerous, unpredictable thing. But the sounds he made were not of anger. They were sounds of pure, unadulterated agony. They were the sounds of a soul being torn apart. She thought of her own nights, of the silent tears she shed into her straw pillow. She recognized his pain, moving as quietly as a shadow. She crossed the space between the barn and the shack. The air grew colder as she left the relative warmth of the hay. She stopped in the doorway, her heart pounding. He had not moved. His shoulders heaved with each ragged breath. Hesitantly, she took a step inside. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet. He flinched at the sound, his head jerking up. In the dim light, she could see the wild terror in his eyes. He looked like a cornered animal. "Mr. Boone?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He stared at her, his chest rising and falling, but did not seem to truly see her. He was still trapped in the inferno of his mind. Clara took another slow step forward. She remembered her mother, in the final stages of her illness, thrashing in a fever dream. She had learned to soothe her with a quiet voice and a gentle touch, without thinking, driven by an instinct she thought had long been buried. She reached out her hand. She paused, her fingers hovering in the air just above his shoulder. Her whole body screamed at the risk, but his trembling was so violent, his pain so palpable. She could not pull back. She let her hand come to rest on his shoulder. His entire body went rigid at her touch. A shudder ran through him, a violent, convulsive tremor. But he did not pull away. She kept her hand there, a small, steady point of contact in the tumultuous darkness. She did not say anything else. There were no words for this kind of pain. After a long moment, the violent shaking began to subside. His breathing slowly deepened, the ragged gasps evening out into shuddering breaths. He lowered his head, his face hidden from her view. Her hand remained on his shoulder, a silent testament. Finally, he seemed to come back to himself. He became aware of her touch, of her presence. He straightened up slowly, and she withdrew her hand as if she had touched a hot iron. He got to his feet, turning away from her to face the hearth. "You should not be in here," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "I heard you fall," she said simply. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders slumped. The silence stretched, thick with things unsaid. "Go back to the barn, Miss Wynne," he said at last, his voice flat and empty. She turned and fled, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. The next time she went into town with Levi, a woman approached her outside the general store. She was a stout, severe-looking widow named Mrs. Kilgore, the self-appointed guardian of the town's morality. She carried a basket on her arm and fixed Clara with a look of pity that was more insulting than any glare. "My dear child," she began, her voice dripping with false concern, "I feel it is my Christian duty to speak with you. We are all so terribly sorry for your circumstances." Clara murmured a noncommittal response, wanting only to escape. "But living out there, Mrs." Kilgore continued, gesturing vaguely toward the prairie. "With that man, it is not proper. It is not safe." "Mr. Boone has been correct," Clara said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Mrs." Kilgore leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He is a damaged man. Child, the war did something to him. He came back with those terrible scars and a darkness in his soul. He is not right. He is dangerous. You would be wise to take the next stagecoach east, back where you belong, before his troubles become your own." The woman's words were meant to frighten her, to isolate her further, but they had the opposite effect. Clara thought of the trembling figure on the floor of the shack, damaged, dangerous. She had been told the same things about herself, in whispers. She looked at Mrs. Kilgore's smug, pious face and felt a flicker of defiance. She gave a slight nod and walked away, leaving the widow staring after her, her mouth agape. A few days later, while cleaning the shack, an unspoken task she had taken upon herself, she discovered the secret of his nightmares. A floorboard near the hearth was loose. Thinking it was simply warped from the heat, she knelt to try and press it back into place. It shifted under her hand, revealing a small, dark cavity beneath. Her first thought was of a mouse or a snake, and she drew back. But her curiosity got the better of her. Reaching into the dusty space, her fingers brushed against something hard and flat, wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it out. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the package. Inside was a small, silver-framed tin-type photograph. It showed a woman with a kind, gentle smile and dark hair swept up from her face. She was holding a small child, a baby wrapped in a white blanket. The woman was looking down at the child with an expression of such pure, unadulterated love that it made Clara's throat ache. It was a portrait of a perfect, happy family. On the back, etched into the metal in a looping script, were two names, Eleanor and little Levi. Clara stared at the image, her mind reeling. This was his story. This was the source of the screams in the night, the fire in his dreams. His fiancée, his child, lost. She remembered the town gossip about a barn fire on his old property, before he had moved to this desolate shack. She remembered Mrs. Kilgore's words, a darkness in his soul. It was not darkness, it was grief. A grief so profound it had hollowed him out, leaving only a scarred and silent shell. She carefully rewrapped the photograph and placed it back in its hiding place, her hands gentle, as if she were handling a sacred relic. That evening, the sky turned a bruised purple, and a cold, driving rain began to fall. Levi was out on the range, checking on his small herd. The storm broke with a sudden, violent fury. Lightning split the sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder. Clara watched from the barn, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. Finally, she saw him, a lone figure on horseback, riding through the deluge. He dismounted and led his horse into the barn, his clothes plastered to his body, water streaming from the brim of his hat. He moved to unsaddle the horse, his back to her. The discovery of the photograph had changed something in her. She could no longer see him as just a silent, intimidating stranger. She saw the husband and father he had almost been. "Who was she? Mr. Boone?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear over the drumming of the rain on the roof. He froze, his hands stilled on the saddle cinch. He did not turn. "That is none of your concern." "I found the photograph," she pressed on, taking a step closer. "Under the floor." He slowly turned to face her. His face was a storm cloud, his eyes flashing with a pain so raw it was like an open wound. The rain dripped from his hair and ran down his scarred jaw. "You had no right." "I know what it is to lose someone," she said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "I know what it is to have a past that haunts you." "You know nothing about me," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. The injustice of his words, of her own situation, suddenly boiled over. Her resentment at being a charity case, a cast-off bride living in a barn, collided with this new, aching empathy for his loss. "And you know nothing of me," she cried, her voice breaking. "Do you think I chose this? To be a widow before I was a wife? To be whispered about and spat on? To live in fear of what the next day will bring?" They stood facing each other in the gloom of the barn, the storm raging around them, their own private tempests finally breaking free. He stared at her, his anger seeming to drain away, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. He saw the fire in her eyes, the proud, desperate set of her jaw. He saw not just the frightened woman from the stagecoach, but a survivor. He took a half-step toward her, his hand lifting slightly, then falling back to his side. His gaze dropped to her hands, which were clenched into tight fists at her sides. Slowly, as if it took all the strength he possessed, he reached out and gently took her right hand. His fingers were cold and wet, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He did not grip or squeeze. He simply laid his hand over hers, a silent acknowledgement, a truce. It was the first time he had willingly touched her. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that shot up her arm. She stared down at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers small and trembling. The rain hammered on the roof, but in that small space, there was a profound and sudden silence. The truce, however, did not last. The shared moment of vulnerability seemed to spook them both, and they retreated back into their tense, silent orbits. A new tension grew between them, a fragile awareness that was both frightening and compelling. Clara found herself resenting her dependence on him, chafing at the fact that her very survival was in his hands. Levi, in turn, seemed to be consumed by his own demons. He believed he was poison, that he brought ruin to everything and everyone he cared for. He saw Eleanor and the baby in the flames every time he closed his eyes. He had failed to protect them, and he would fail to protect this woman too. He began to pull away even further, his silences growing longer and heavier. The breaking point came on a hot, still afternoon weeks later. Clara was out near her small garden, pulling weeds, when she felt a sharp, searing pain in her calf. She looked down and saw the diamond-patterned coils of a rattlesnake slithering back into the tall grass. A cry escaped her lips as she stumbled back, clutching her leg. 2 small puncture wounds were already beginning to swell and turn a dark, ugly purple. Levi was mending a bridle outside the shack and saw her fall. He was at her side in an instant. One look at her leg and his face went pale beneath its tan. "Snake," he bit out. He swept her up into his arms and carried her into the shack, laying her on his bunk. The world was already beginning to swim before Clara's eyes, a wave of nausea and cold fear washing over her. "Stay still," he commanded, his voice tight with urgency. He pulled a long, sharp knife from his belt. He knelt beside her, his movements swift and sure. Without a word of warning, he ripped the hem of her skirt, exposing her leg to the knee. He made 2 small, quick cuts over the bite, connecting the puncture wounds. Clara cried out as a fresh wave of pain shot through her. Then he bent his head, his face close to her wound. She felt the warmth of his breath, and then the shocking, intimate pressure of his mouth on her skin as he began to suck the venom from the wound. He spat the poisoned blood onto the dirt floor, his face grim, and then lowered his head again. The world began to fade to black at the edges for Clara, through a haze of pain and delirium. She was aware of him working, of the strength in his hands, of his complete, desperate focus on saving her. That night, the fever took hold. She lay on his bunk, shivering and burning, drifting in and out of a nightmarish delirium. Levi sat by her side, bathing her face with a cool, damp cloth. He did not leave her. He watched her, his face a stoic mask that could not quite hide the fear in his eyes. Sometime deep in the night, the fever broke, the shivering subsided. and she found herself drenched in sweat, weak but lucid. The shack was quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. Levi was sitting on the floor beside the bunk, his back against the wall, his eyes closed. She thought he was asleep, but as she shifted, his eyes opened. They were filled with an exhaustion so profound it made him look years older. She was alive. He had saved her. He had not flinched from the ugliness of the task. He had put his mouth on her and drawn the poison out. The intimacy of it was a staggering, terrifying thing. Tears began to well in her eyes and slip down her temples into her hair. They were not tears of pain or fear, but of a desperate, aching gratitude. She looked at his weary, scarred face in the firelight. He was still a stranger, a man of shadows and silence, but he was here. He had not abandoned her. "Please," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. Her hand moved, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric of his sleeve. "Promise me you'll stay near." Levi looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He saw the tears on her face, the raw vulnerability in her eyes. He heard the plea that was not just about tonight, but about all the lonely, terrifying nights to come. He did not answer. He did not move. He just sat there, in the quiet of the small, lonely shack, and watched her as the fire burned low. The fever was a thief. It stole Clara's strength, her awareness, leaving her a trembling, hollowed-out version of herself. She drifted in a scorching, merciless sea, tossed between waves of fire and ice. The world became a series of fractured sensations, the rough texture of the wool blanket against her chin, the parched, cracking landscape of her own lips, the low, constant crackle of the fire in the hearth. And through it all, there was Levi. He was a constant, solid presence in the heart of her delirium. He refused to leave her side. She would wake, briefly, to find him there. His hands, which she had only ever known to be steady and sure on the reins of a horse or the handle of an axe, were trembling as he held a cup of water to her mouth. He would spoon thin broth between her lips, his movements clumsy with a desperate, unpracticed tenderness. He bathed her face and her wrists with a damp cloth, his touch so light it was almost imperceptible, as if he were afraid she might break. He was a man who flinched from contact, who built walls of silence around himself, now forced into an intimacy so profound it was a world unto itself. He did not speak. He simply worked, a grim, solitary sentinel fighting a battle against the poison that coursed through her veins. In the depths of the fever, her past rose up to claim her. She was a child again, sitting on a low stool while her mother, smelling of lavender water and fading hope, drew a comb through her long, dark hair. The pull was gentle, the rhythm soothing. Her mother was humming a soft, sad lullaby, a song about a ship lost at sea. The memory was so vivid, so full of warmth and love, that Clara would weep in her sleep, her hands reaching for a phantom touch. Then the vision would shatter, the lavender scent replaced by the sour stench of whiskey. The gentle pull of the comb became the cruel grip of a heavy hand in her hair. Her stepfather's face, a mask of slack-jawed anger, would loom over her, his voice a low, menacing growl that promised pain. She saw the glint of his belt buckle in the lamplight, saw his fists clench and unclench. In her delirium, she would begin to thrash, her limbs flailing, a wild, terrified cry catching in her throat as she tried to fight off the ghosts that assailed her. During these violent episodes, Levi would be there. He would kneel by the bunk, his own face a mask of helpless anguish, and take her wrists in his hands. His grip was not bruising or restrictive. It was firm, yet gentle, a human anchor in the storm of her memories. He would hold her steady, his low voice a constant rumble beneath the chaos of her terror. He never said much. "Easy now. You are safe. I am here." The words were simple, repeated like a mantra, a prayer against the darkness. He held on until the thrashing subsided, until her cries softened into whimpers, and she fell back into a restless, exhausted sleep. For Clara, whose entire life had taught her that a man's touch was a weapon, this gentle restraint was a language she had never known. He was holding her, not to hurt her, but to keep her from hurting herself. On the third day of the fever, a visitor arrived. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the straight-backed posture of a military officer rode up to the shack. Levi met him outside, his stance immediately becoming more rigid, more guarded. Clara watched them through a slit in the shuttered window, her head pounding with a dull ache. "Boone," the man said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a commander. "I heard about Coulter. A bad business." "It was," Levi replied, his voice flat. "I also heard his mail-order bride is staying with you," the man continued, his sharp eyes flicking toward the shack. "Sheriff Hart is not a man known for his imagination. He will look for the easiest answer. She had nothing to do with it." The man grunted. "Perhaps not. But Ephraim Coulter was never a simple man. He always had a hand in ventures outside of Army regulations. You know that. There are old accounts that were never settled, things from the war best left buried. His death might just be a piece of that old business finally coming home to roost." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Some of those ventures involved smuggling supplies, Boone, and some of the men he dealt with were not the kind to forgive a debt." Levi's face was unreadable, a stone carving. "That past is dead." "Is it?" the commander asked softly. "Be careful, son. You are standing in the shadow of a dead man. Make sure it does not fall on you." He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. Slowly, painstakingly, Clara began to recover. The fever receded, leaving her weak and fragile, as if she had been hollowed out from the inside. Her body ached, and she had little appetite. But the world began to come back into focus. She was no longer in the barn. Levi had moved her pallet of straw and her blankets inside, placing them on the floor near the hearth, across from his own narrow bunk. The shack was small, the space between them barely wide enough for a man to walk through, but it felt as vast as the prairie itself. They fell into a new, unspoken routine. They slept in the same room, two solitary figures in the darkness, separated by a chasm of unspoken fears and traumas. They never touched. They barely spoke. But his presence was a constant comfort. The sound of his steady breathing in the night was a bulwark against the ghosts of her past. She no longer felt entirely alone. The nights grew colder. A hard frost coated the prairie each morning, and the wind had a sharp, biting edge. One night, the cold was so intense it seeped through the chinks in the walls and crept into her bones. She lay shivering on her pallet, curled into a tight ball, unable to find warmth. Levi, lying in his bunk, could hear the chatter of her teeth. He lay still for a long time, his own body rigid, a silent war raging within him. Finally, he rose from his bunk. In the dim flickering light of the dying embers, he crossed the small space between them. He lay down on the pallet behind her, his movements stiff and deliberate. She felt the warmth of his body before he ever touched her. He hesitated for a long moment. Then he reached out and gently pulled her back against his chest. Clara went utterly still. Her entire body was a knot of tension. It was the first time they had touched with such deliberate, sustained intimacy. He was solid and warm behind her, a wall of living heat against her shivering back. His arm came to rest over her waist, his hand lying loosely on her stomach. It was not a lover's embrace. It was something far simpler and far more profound. It was the sharing of warmth against the cold, a basic animal act of comfort and survival. Slowly, the tension drained out of her. The shivering subsided. She leaned back into his solidness, into the steady rhythm of his heart beating against her spine. And for the first time in her memory, she felt completely, utterly safe. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The touch, once initiated, became a fragile bridge between them, A few nights later, they were sitting by the fire, the silence between them comfortable now. Familiar. Clara was mending one of his shirts, and he was oiling a piece of leather. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the rough timber walls, making the small space feel like the only sanctuary in a vast, dark world. She looked up, and her eyes met his across the flames. In his gaze, she saw a reflection of her own loneliness, her own deep, unspoken yearning for connection. He looked at her, and for the first time, he did not look away. He saw not a burden, not a cast-off bride, but the woman who had put her hand on his shoulder in his darkest moment, the woman who had slept in his arms. Neither of them moved for a long time. Then, slowly, as if drawn by an invisible thread, he leaned forward. She met him halfway. Their lips met, there in the quiet glow of the firelight. The kiss was not passionate, not demanding. It was hesitant, tentative, a question asked without words. It was quiet and desperate. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow and a fragile, burgeoning hope. It was the kiss of two survivors, two ghosts who had found in each other a flicker of life. The moment was too much. The intensity of the connection, the sheer, overwhelming vulnerability of it, was more than Levi could bear. He broke the kiss, pulling back as if he had been burned. He stood up abruptly and turned his back to her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I cannot," he breathed, his voice ragged. "I cannot give you what you need." The words were a blade to her heart. All her old insecurities, her feelings of being unwanted, of being broken, rushed back in. But then she looked at his rigid, suffering back, and she saw not rejection, but fear, his fear. "And what is it you think I need, Mr. Boone?" she asked, her own voice quiet but steady. "A husband," he said, his back still to her. "A home, a normal life, a man who is not broken. I bring ruin to everything I touch." She stood up and walked to stand behind him. Close but not touching. "I have never in my life had a normal life," she said softly, "and I have never needed more than two things from any person: truth and kindness. You have given me both. You took me from a cage. You have fed me and sheltered me. You held me when I was lost in fever. You have never lied to me. Do not presume to know what I need." He slowly turned to face her, his eyes filled with a storm of conflicting emotions. He saw no pity in her face, no accusation. He saw only a quiet strength that mirrored his own. Before he could speak, a new day dawned, and with it came the violence his former commander had foretold. They were in the woods that bordered his property, gathering firewood. When it happened, a single shot rang out, the crack echoing through the pines. A splinter of bark exploded from a tree just inches from Levi's head. His reaction was instantaneous. He grabbed Clara and shoved her to the ground behind a thick, fallen log, his body shielding hers. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl as he drew the revolver from his hip. Another shot ripped through the leaves above them. Levi peered over the log, trying to locate the source of the attack. Clara, her heart hammering against her ribs, saw a flicker of movement in a thicket of brush about 50 yards away. A man was reloading a rifle, a burly figure with a thick, dark beard. He was raising the rifle again, taking aim directly at Levi's exposed position. There was no time to think. Levi's spare rifle was leaning against the log beside her. Without a moment's hesitation, Clara grabbed it. The weapon was heavy and awkward in her hands. She had only ever fired a gun a handful of times in her life, but a fierce, protective instinct she never knew she possessed surged through her. She rested the barrel on the log, took aim as she had seen Levi do, and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder, the sound deafening. Through the smoke, she saw the man in the brush stagger, clutching his chest. He dropped his rifle and fell to his knees, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. Levi stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. Then he was up and running toward the fallen man, his own gun still raised. Clara scrambled after him. They reached the man as he slumped to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. He was gasping, his eyes wide with pain and the finality of death. He looked past Levi, his gaze fixing on Clara. "Ephraim," he rasped, a bloody froth on his lips. Then his eyes went vacant, and he was still. Clara stared down at the man she had just killed, a wave of nausea and shock washing over her. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold the rifle. Levi knelt beside the body. He pulled back the man's shirt. Burned into the skin of his chest was a brand, the symbol of a large rival ranch owned by the cattle baron Matheson, the man Ephraim Coulter had supposedly owed money to. They stood there for a long time in the silent woods, the dead man at their feet, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the cold air. The bond between them, forged in sickness and quiet desperation, had been tempered in a crucible of violence. It was no longer about mere survival. It was about fierce, unwavering loyalty. They were in this together, without a word. Levi picked up the man's rifle and began to drag the body deeper into the woods. Clara followed, carrying their axe. They found a place beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient pine tree and began to dig. They worked in silence, their movements synchronized, a grim and terrible partnership. They buried him deep, covering the raw earth with pine needles and fallen leaves until there was no sign of what lay beneath. That night, the silence in the shack was different. It was not a silence of distance, but of shared knowledge, of a dark secret that bound them together more tightly than any vow. After their meager meal, Levi led her not to the shack, but to the barn. He lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows. He stood before her in the center of the barn, the place where she had first taken refuge. Slowly, he began to unbutton his shirt. He shrugged it off his shoulders, letting it fall to the floor. He turned his back to her. In the soft lantern light, she saw what he had hidden. His back was a roadmap of old scars, not the puckered, twisted scars of a burn, but the thin, white, crisscrossing lines of a lash. It was the mark of a profound and brutal punishment, a history of pain he had carried in silence. He stood there, his back to her, offering her his most vulnerable, most shaming secret. Clara felt a wave of profound, aching empathy wash over her. She did not touch him. Instead, she began to unbutton her own dress. The worn gray fabric pooled at her feet. She stood before him in her thin chemise, her own scars, the faint, silvery lines from her stepfather's belt, the emotional wounds that were far deeper, bared to him in the silent, golden light. It was not an act of seduction. It was a confession, a communion. It was a silent, solemn vow. I see your brokenness, and I show you mine. I am not afraid. A restless energy had taken root in Clay Ridge, a fever born of greed. The railroad was coming. The promise of it was a tangible thing, a metallic taste on the wind. Surveyors with tripods and notebooks appeared on the horizon, and with them came strangers in city clothes, men with cold eyes and fat wallets, looking to buy up land and futures. The tension between the established ranchers, men like Matheson, and the newcomers was a taut wire humming in the dusty air. Money, claims, and the impatient, grinding noise of progress put everyone on edge. In the midst of this simmering pot, the body in the woods was a stone tossed in, sending ripples of unease through the town. Sheriff Hart, his face grimmer than usual, rode out to the shack. He found Levi and Clara near the barn, the silence between them a fortress. A hunter found a fresh grave deep in the pines, Hart said, his eyes fixed on Levi, then shifting to Clara. No marker. Looked like it was dug in a hurry. You two wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Clara's heart began a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She felt Levi tense beside her, a coiled spring of readiness. She stepped forward slightly, placing herself in the sheriff's line of sight. We were robbed, she said. the lie tasting like rust in her dry mouth. She forced her voice to remain steady, pitching it with a note of remembered fear. "A drifter. I think. He came out of the woods with a rifle, demanding money. We had none to give. He grew angry." She let her hands tremble, a performance that required little effort. Levi fought with him. The gun went off. The man was dead. Hart's gaze was sharp, probing for weakness. "And you just decided to bury him yourselves, not to report it?" "We were afraid," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I am already looked upon with suspicion in this town. We thought no one would believe us. We thought they would blame Levi." She looked down at her hands, a perfect picture of a frightened, helpless woman. The sheriff chewed on the inside of his cheek. His eyes narrowed. The story was plausible enough. Drifters were common, and violence was a part of life. He looked from Clara's bowed head to Levi's stony, unreadable face. "Finally," he grunted. "If any other bodies turn up, Boone, my questions will be sharper," he warned. "You keep her out of trouble." He turned his horse and rode away, a figure of reluctant, unsatisfied law. When he was gone, Levi looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face. He said nothing, but in his gaze was a profound, unspoken acknowledgement. She had not flinched. She had stood before the law and lied for him, weaving a shield of words around them both. The secret of the dead man was theirs alone now, a dark seed planted in the foundation of their bond. That night, Levi spoke of Ephraim Coulter's land. "It is a curse," he said, his voice low as he stared into the fire. "Whatever business Coulter was in, it got him killed. It nearly got me killed. I should sell it. There are men in town now who would pay for it. Sight unseen. The money would be enough for you to get a ticket back east, to start over somewhere clean." The thought was a cold shock. Leave? After everything, his solution was to send her away? An old, familiar anger flared within her, the anger of being treated as a problem to be solved, a package to be shipped. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "It was meant to be my home. I will not let it be sold off like a piece of unclaimed baggage. I want to see it." "There is nothing to see," he argued, his tone hardening. "It is just miles of rock and dust." "Then I will see rock and dust," she insisted, her chin lifting. "It was the reason I came to this place. I will not leave without seeing it with my own eyes. I need to know what I have lost." He stared at her, at the stubborn, unyielding set of her jaw. He saw that she would not be moved. He gave a single, sharp nod. "We ride at dawn." The journey was harder than she could have imagined. They left the open prairie behind and entered a landscape of jagged rock and unforgiving canyons. The trail was a narrow ledge cut into the side of a cliff, with a sheer drop to a rock-strewn riverbed below. The horses picked their way carefully, their hooves dislodging cascades of scree that rattled into the abyss. They rode in silence, the vast, monumental indifference of the landscape dwarfing all human concerns. On the second day, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The wind picked up, howling through the narrow passes, a mournful, menacing sound. Dark clouds boiled over the canyon rim, and the air grew heavy and cold. The storm broke upon them with the sudden, explosive fury of an ambush. Rain came down in blinding, horizontal sheets, turning the trail to a slick, treacherous river of mud. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, its brilliant flashes followed by cracks of thunder that were so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. Their horses, terrified, began to slip and slide on the treacherous path. Levi, his face a grim mask against the onslaught, grabbed the reins of her horse and led them forward, searching for shelter. He found it just as the last of the daylight was being swallowed by the storm. A shallow cave, a dark mouth in the side of the cliff face, barely large enough for them and the two horses. They stumbled inside, soaked and shivering, the roar of the storm a constant, deafening presence. Levi unsaddled the horses and managed to start a small, sputtering fire with the dry kindling he carried in his saddlebags. In the flickering, uncertain light, they looked at each other. They were trapped, two small creatures huddled against a primal, elemental rage. The cold was a bitter, invasive thing. Clara's teeth chattered uncontrollably, and she wrapped her arms around herself, but it was no use. The damp chill had settled deep in her bones. Levi watched her, his expression tight with a mixture of concern and his own deep-seated demons. He stripped the wet blankets from the saddles and draped one around her shoulders, but she was still shivering violently. He moved closer, the small space of the cave shrinking around them. He sat beside her, so close their knees were touching. He did not speak. He simply reached out and pulled her against him, wrapping his own arms and the second blanket around them both. His body was a source of solid, radiating heat. She leaned into him, her head coming to rest on his shoulder, and slowly, the violent tremors began to subside. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the storm, their shared warmth a fragile truce against the chaos outside. The fire cast their shadows, huge and dancing, on the rock wall behind them, in the enclosed space. Every sound was magnified. The hiss of the rain, the crackle of the flames, the frantic beating of her own heart. She lifted her head and looked at him. His face was inches from hers, illuminated by the firelight. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and his eyes, in the wavering light, were dark pools of an emotion she could not name. All the walls they had so carefully constructed between them, all the silences and the fears, were stripped away by the storm, by the cold, by the simple, profound fact of their survival. He lowered his head, and she met his kiss. This was not the hesitant, questioning kiss of before. This was acclaiming. It was aching with all their unspoken loneliness, furious with a defiant rage against the world that had tried to break them. It was raw, stripped of all artifice, a collision of two souls who had been starved for a touch that was not violent, for a warmth that was not a fire that consumed. His hands were in her hair, his mouth hungry against hers, and she clung to him, her fingers digging into the hard muscle of his back. They came together on the hard, cold floor of the cave, their movements urgent, desperate. It was not gentle. It was a storm of its own, a release of all the pent-up grief and fear and longing that had been their constant companions. It was a furious, aching, beautiful act of life in the face of death. And when it was over, they lay tangled together under the blankets, their bodies slick with sweat, the sound of their ragged breathing slowly evening out as the storm outside began to recede. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. The rain had softened to a gentle drumming on the rock outside. The world was quiet again. "I have never felt safe before," she whispered into the darkness, the words an admission she had never even dared to think. "Not once in my entire life. Not until now." A shudder went through him, a deep, convulsive tremor. She felt a wetness on her cheek and realized with a shock that he was weeping, not with loud, racking sobs, but with a silent, profound brokenness, the tears slipping from his eyes and into her hair. He held her tighter, his body shaking with the force of his grief. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of years of pain and guilt and sorrow finally being allowed to surface. He turned his face into her hair, his voice a raw, broken rasp against her ear. "I will keep you safe," he vowed, the words torn from the very depths of him. "I will, even if I have to protect you from myself." The next morning, the world was washed clean. They rode out of the canyon under a pale, clear sky, the air crisp and cold. The silence between them was different now, filled not with distance but with the shared, intimate knowledge of the night before. They found Ephraim Coulter's land in a hidden valley, a small, grassy expanse surrounded by tall pines. It was not just rock and dust. It had been a home, or it had tried to be. In the center of the valley were the charred ruins of a small cabin and a barn. The blackened timbers a stark skeleton against the green grass. As they explored the ruins, Levi found a set of small, weathered bones scattered near what had been the cabin's hearth. They were too small to be human, perhaps a dog or a coyote. But a short distance away, under the shade of a large, solitary oak tree, they found what turned the blood in Clara's veins to ice. It was a small, crude grave, marked with a cross made of 2 branches tied together with twine. At the base of the cross was a flat stone, and scratched into its surface was a single word: Mary. Clara knelt before the small grave, her hand tracing the rough letters. A child. Ephraim Coulter had had a child. She looked at the burned-out cabin, at the small, lonely grave, and a terrible, heartbreaking story began to piece itself together in her mind. Inside the ruins of the cabin, half buried in the ash and debris near the collapsed fireplace, Clara found something the fire had not completely consumed. It was a leather-bound journal, its cover scorched and its pages water-stained and brittle. Many of the entries were illegible, but she was able to decipher some of the last few pages. Ephraim's rough script spoke of a life he was trying to escape. Matheson will not let it go. One entry read, "He says the debt from the war is never paid. He thinks I cheated him, but he was the one who wanted to smuggle rifles. Not just supplies. I told him I was done. Mary is gone. There is nothing left for me in that life. I will take my child and live clean. This land is all we have. It is a new start." Clara's breath caught in her throat. He had a secret child, a daughter, not a son. He had tried to leave his violent past behind, to raise his daughter here, in this secluded valley. But the past had found him. The fire had not been an accident. The journey back was a somber, silent affair. The knowledge of what had happened in that valley lay heavy between them. As they were navigating a steep, rocky descent, Clara's horse lost its footing on a patch of loose shale. The animal went down with a terrified scream, and Clara was thrown clear. She landed hard, her head striking a rock. The world exploded in a flash of white pain, and then there was only darkness. She awoke to the sensation of being lifted. Levi's arms were around her, his face a mask of terror and grim determination. There was a deep gash on her forehead, and blood was trickling down her temple, matting her hair. "The horse," she mumbled, her tongue thick and clumsy. "Leg is broken. I had to put her down," he said, his voice tight. "Hold on." He carried her, for miles. He carried her through the unforgiving terrain, his steps sure and steady, even as his breath came in ragged gasps. She drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the rhythmic motion, of the strength in the arms that held her, of the warm stickiness of her own blood on his shirt. He was fulfilling his vow, his body a living shield between her and the harshness of the land. They reached the shack as dusk was settling, Levi's face gray with exhaustion. He cleaned and bandaged her head wound, his touch gentle, his eyes dark with a fear he could not voice. The next day, he rode into town for supplies and news. He returned with a grim look on his face. "There is talk," he said, his voice low. "The railroad surveyors have been all over the canyon. They say the main line has to go straight through Coulter's Valley. It is the only passable route, and men have been asking questions, asking about Coulter, asking about his legal next of kin." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "A lawyer who works for the railroad was found dead 2 days ago, the same way Coulter was. His throat was cut." Clara sat up, the world spinning for a moment. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. Ephraim's land was not just a secluded valley. It was a vital piece of the future, and someone, Matheson most likely, was killing anyone with a legal claim to it, clearing the way to sell it to the railroad for a fortune. She looked at Levi, her eyes wide with a new and terrible understanding. The marriage license in her tattered suitcase, the document that had brought her here, was not just a memory of a life that never was. It was a death warrant. Someone still believed she held Ephraim's deed. The first warning was the smell. It crept into the shack on a cold, moonless night. A sharp, acrid scent that snagged in the back of Clara's throat and pulled her from a deep sleep. She sat up on her pallet, her heart suddenly racing. The air was thick with it, the unmistakable smell of burning hay and dry timber. Then she saw it, a hellish orange light flickering against the single window of the shack. "Levi," she breathed, scrambling to her feet. "Levi, wake up!" He was already moving. He had slept in his trousers, and in an instant, he was at the door, flinging it open. The sight that met them was an image from his deepest nightmares. The barn, their sanctuary, her first refuge, was engulfed in flames. Fire roared from the hayloft, a living, hungry beast, devouring the old wood and spewing a column of black smoke and glowing embers into the night sky. The horses. The thought was a shared, silent scream between them. "Stay here," Levi yelled, his voice a raw command against the roar of the fire, but she was already right behind him. He ran toward the inferno, grabbing a bucket from the well as he went, a futile gesture against the raging blaze. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that drove them back. The main doors of the barn were already a sheet of flame. "The back!" Levi shouted, his face illuminated by the terrible light, his scars standing out in stark, crimson relief. He grabbed her arm, pulling her around the side of the building where the smoke was thickest. He kicked open the smaller rear door and plunged into the choking blackness. Clara stood frozen for a second, the heat blistering her skin, the sound of the fire a deafening, terrifying roar. Inside, she could hear the panicked, high-pitched screaming of the horses, a sound of pure animal terror that would be seared into her memory forever. She saw Levi's silhouette appear in the doorway, wrestling with his frantic horse, its eyes wide and white with fear. He slapped its rump, and the animal bolted out into the relative safety of the night. He turned to go back in. "Levi, no!" Clara screamed, her voice lost in the noise. "You cannot!" He ignored her. He disappeared back into the suffocating smoke. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Clara stared at the doorway, expecting to see him emerge, expecting him to be right behind the second horse, but there was nothing. The roar of the fire intensified, and a section of the roof groaned, then collapsed inward with a shower of sparks and flame. A primal fear, colder and more terrible than the heat of the fire, seized her. She took a step toward the doorway, ready to follow him in, to die with him in the flames. Just then, he stumbled out, half dragging, half carrying the second horse, which was wild with terror. A burning beam crashed down in the spot where he had been standing a moment before. He and the horse burst from the smoke, and Levi collapsed to his knees, coughing, his body racked with violent, shuddering gasps for air. The second horse, its mane singed, galloped off into the darkness. Clara ran to him, falling to her knees beside him. His face was black with soot, his hair and eyebrows singed. He had saved them. He had walked into the fire, the very thing that haunted his sleep, and saved them all. She put her hands on his back, feeling the tremors that shook his entire body. He was not just coughing from the smoke. He was shaking with the aftershocks of a trauma relived. By dawn, the barn was a heap of smoldering, blackened timbers. The fire had burned itself out, leaving a gaping, ugly wound on the land. They stood together, two soot-stained figures watching the last of the smoke drift away into the cold morning sky. There was no doubt in either of their minds. This had not been an accident. Someone had tried to burn them alive. The news of the fire traveled as fast as the flames themselves. By mid-morning, a small crowd of townsfolk had gathered at the edge of the property, drawn by the column of smoke and a morbid curiosity. They did not offer help. They stood in a grim, silent line, their faces a mixture of fear and accusation. The whispers started, carried on the wind. It was her, they said, the strange woman from the east. Trouble had followed her here. First Ephraim Coulter, Now this. It was unnatural. Mrs. Kilgore was there, her face a mask of pious certainty. "It is the devil's work," she declared to the small crowd huddled around her. "She has bewitched that poor, damaged man. She is a whore and a witch, and she has brought a curse upon this land." The words were poison darts. Witch, whore. Clara felt the old, familiar shame wash over her, hot and suffocating. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to become invisible. But then she felt Levi move beside her. He walked toward them. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, his face set in grim, hard lines. The soot and ash that covered him made him look like a vengeful spirit risen from the grave. He walked right up to the line of men who stood before the women, his pale eyes burning with a cold fire. "Get off my land," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. A big, beefy rancher, one of Matheson's men, laughed. "This is your land now, Boone? Or did you just take Coulter's woman and his property both?" Something in Levi snapped. All the silence, all the restraint, all the carefully controlled pain of the last years broke apart. He lunged forward, and his fist connected with the rancher's jaw with a sickening, wet crack. The man staggered back, stunned. Two of his friends moved to join the fight, and in an instant, the tense standoff exploded into a messy, brutal brawl. Levi fought with a silent, terrifying fury. He was not a brawler. He was a soldier. He moved with a grim economy of motion, his fists striking like hammers. He took a punch to the side of his head that sent him stumbling, but he came back, his face a mask of cold rage, and drove his attacker into the dirt. He was outnumbered, but he fought with the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. Clara watched from the shadows of the shack, her hands pressed to her mouth, her body shivering. This was for her. This violent, bloody spectacle was for her honor, an honor she did not even believe she possessed. She saw him go down under a pile of men, saw the flash of bloody knuckles, the grunts of pain. He was fighting for her, and it was tearing him apart. The fight was broken up by the arrival of Sheriff Hart, who waded into the melee with a shotgun in his hands. The crowd dispersed, muttering and casting dark looks back at the shack. Levi was left standing alone, his chest heaving, his lips split and bleeding, his knuckles raw and scraped. He stood there, a solitary, defiant figure in the ruins of his life, demanding a justice the town would never give him. He did not look at her. He turned and walked away, toward the river, a man who needed to be alone with his rage and his pain. Later that day, a buggy rattled up to the shack. It was Mrs. Kilgore. Clara met her outside, her posture stiff, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. "Child," the older woman said, her voice softer now, laced with what might have been genuine pity. "You cannot stay here. You see how it is. They will not let you be. They will destroy you both." She reached into her reticule. "I have some money put aside. It is not much, but it is enough to buy you a stagecoach ticket back east. Go home. Forget this terrible place." Clara looked at the woman's outstretched hand, then at her face. Go home. The words were a mockery. She had no home. Her only home was a memory of pain and a shallow grave on a hillside. She looked out toward the river, where Levi had gone. "I cannot," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "Do not be a fool," Mrs. Kilgore insisted. "That man can offer you nothing but more of this, more violence, more sorrow. He is a ghost, and he will drag you down into the grave with him." Clara met the widow's eyes, and for the first time, Mrs. Kilgore saw not a frightened girl, but a woman made of iron and fire. "Then I will die where he is," Clara said. She turned without another word and went back inside the shack. 2 days later, another visitor arrived. This one was a man in a dusty but well-made suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, a lawyer from Cheyenne, representing the interests of the Union Pacific Railroad. "I am here regarding the estate of the late Ephraim Coulter," he said, his eyes taking in the ruin of the barn and the grim state of the shack. He looked from Levi's bruised face to the bandage on Clara's head. "I have reviewed the documents on file. It appears, Miss Wynne, that your marriage license was legally recorded. While the marriage was not consummated under territorial law, you are his legal widow. You are the sole heir to his property and holding." He opened his briefcase and produced a thick document tied with a ribbon. It was the deed to the land in the Hidden Valley. "This is now yours, madam. The railroad is, of course, prepared to make you a very generous offer for the property. It is vital to our expansion." Clara stared at the deed, the legal proof of a life she had never lived, the cause of so much death and destruction. It felt heavy in her hands, heavy with the weight of blood. When the lawyer had gone, leaving a purchase offer on the table that was more money than Clara had ever imagined, Levi spoke. His voice was low and urgent, his face etched with a desperate seriousness. "Take it," he said. "Clara, you must take the money, take the deed, and go. Go as far away from here as you can, to California, to Oregon. Start a new life, a clean one. You heard the lawyer. You are a wealthy woman now. You do not need this place. You do not need me." His words were meant to free her, but they felt like a betrayal. She looked at his bruised face, at the raw knuckles of the hands that had fought for her, that had held her through fever and nightmare. She thought of the man weeping in her arms in the cave. "I am not leaving," she said, her voice trembling with a fierce, unwavering resolve. "I am not abandoning you. I am a danger to you," he said, his voice rising, cracking with a pain that went far beyond his physical wounds. "Do you not see? Everything around me burns. My family, my home, this barn. I cannot protect you. I will only destroy you." "You are the only person in my entire life who has ever tried to protect me," she shot back, her own voice thick with tears. "Do you think I would leave you now? To face Matheson alone? The land is mine, but the fight is ours. I will not run, not anymore." Their argument was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Hart. He dismounted slowly, his face weary, the face of a man who was carrying a weight too heavy for him. "I came to tell you to be careful," he said, not looking at either of them, his gaze fixed on the smoldering ruins of the barn. "I have known for some time that Matheson was behind this. Coulter worked for him during the war, and after, they were smugglers. According to the stories, Coulter cheated him out of a significant sum and then disappeared. Matheson has a long memory and a powerful grudge." He finally looked at them, his eyes old and tired. "I am one man, and Matheson has 20 guns on his payroll. There is no official justice to be had here. Whatever you are planning to do, you will be doing it alone." When he was gone, a grim resolve settled over the small shack. They were alone. The law had turned its back on them, but they had the truth. They had Ephraim's journal. "We can use it," Clara said, her mind racing. "The journal. It proves Matheson was a smuggler. It implicates him in crimes against the army. If it were to fall into the hands of a federal marshal—" "Matheson would never let that happen," Levi finished for her, a plan beginning to form in his cold, pale eyes. "We can use it as bait. We will send word to him, a message that we have evidence of his crimes and we are willing to sell it, for a price. We tell him to meet us, alone." "Where?" Clara asked. "The canyon," Levi said, his voice grim. "On the trail to Coulter's Valley. It is narrow, treacherous ground, a place where 2 people might have a chance against more than 2. It was a desperate, suicidal plan, a long shot in the dark against a man who held all the power. But it was the only plan they had. On the eve of the confrontation, after the message had been sent with a young boy from town who was promised a silver dollar, a heavy, suffocating tension descended upon the shack. They sat before the fire, the silence between them filled with the enormity of what was to come. They were likely riding to their deaths. Clara reached out and took his hand. His fingers, calloused and bruised, curled around hers. "Do not go without me tomorrow," she whispered, her eyes pleading with him. "Do not try to leave me behind to keep me safe." She squeezed his hand, her voice dropping, filled with all the fear and love she could no longer hold back. "Promise me you will stay near." He looked at her, his gaze intense, stripping away all her defenses. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw an unbending core of strength. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "Even if I burn," he answered, his voice a low, solemn vow. The words hung in the air between them, a promise of utter, absolute devotion. He was no longer running from the fire. He was willing to walk into it. For her. Later, as the embers in the hearth burned low, they came together. They undressed each other slowly. In the silent, flickering light, there was no desperation in their movements now, no fury. It was a slow, deliberate, almost reverent act of love. They stood naked before the fire and before each other. All scars, both old and new, bared in the warm glow. There were no secrets left between them. They lay down together on the pallet, their bodies fitting together, their legs entwined. They made love with a quiet, aching tenderness, a silent communication of every fear, every hope, every sorrow they had ever known. It was a farewell, and it was a prayer. It was a final, desperate affirmation of life in the face of the encroaching darkness. They lay together in the silence, their skin illuminated by the dying fire, knowing, with a terrible, beautiful certainty, that it might be their last night alive. The world before dawn was a landscape of gray ghosts and cold stone. They rode without speaking. The only sounds, the soft creak of saddle leather and the careful clatter of their horses' hooves on the rocky trail. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of pine and the coming day. Clara rode beside Levi, the weight of the revolver on her hip a cold, alien presence. Ephraim's journal was wrapped in oilcloth and tucked deep in her saddlebag, a testament of a dead man that they hoped would save the living. She looked at Levi in the pale, pre-dawn light. His face was carved from granite, all hard lines and grim resolve. The bruises from his fight in the town had faded to a sickly yellow, and his split lip was healing, but the wounds inside him were still fresh. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the hardness in his eyes softened. It was a look that encompassed everything: the fear, the desperation, the terrible, beautiful certainty of the night they had just shared. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a silent promise. Together. They reached the mouth of the canyon just as the first rays of sun crested the eastern peaks, spilling a weak, watery light onto the high rock walls. And they were waiting. Not in ambush, not hidden behind rocks, but out in the open, as if holding a formal, deadly court. There were 4 of them. A big, powerful man with a graying beard and cold, confident eyes sat easily on a magnificent black horse. This had to be Matheson. 3 other men, hard-faced and carrying rifles, were positioned on foot around him. They had chosen their ground well. A wide, open space just before the trail narrowed into the treacherous pass. There was no way around them. Levi drew his horse to a halt, and Clara stopped beside him. The space between the 2 groups was 100 yards of dusty, silent ground. The air was utterly still. "Boone!" Matheson's voice boomed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, a voice that owned the very air it moved through. "I was surprised to get your message. I thought you would have been smarter than to crawl back into Coulter's mess, and bringing the woman with you, that is poor planning." "We have something you want, Matheson," Levi called back, his own voice flat and steady, giving away nothing. Matheson laughed, a deep, ugly sound. "Coulter's land? I will have that in due time. The railroad pays well." "More than that," Levi said. "We have his journal, The one that details your wartime activities. Smuggling rifles to Confederate irregulars, selling army supplies on the black market, cheating the government, and cheating your own men. I imagine a federal marshal would find it very interesting reading. Matheson's smile tightened. His eyes, the color of muddy water, narrowed on them. Coulter was always a scribbler, a sentimental fool. That was his undoing. He betrayed me. Boone took a great deal of my money and ran, thinking he could disappear and play homesteader with his little girl. A flicker of something truly evil crossed his face. I taught him that no one walks away from me. I made him watch as I cleansed his new life with fire, and then I sent him to hell to join them. Clara felt a wave of nausea. He was admitting it, boasting of it. He had murdered Ephraim's child. The journal in her saddlebag suddenly felt like it was burning. "The journal is yours for a price," Levi said, his voice like ice. $5,000. And safe passage out of this territory for the two of us. Matheson considered this, stroking his beard. "A bold request, but how do I know you have it?" Clara reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the scorched, leather-bound book, holding it up for him to see. "It is right here," she called, her voice clearer and stronger than she thought possible. "The woman has spirit," Matheson said with a smirk, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Very well. Bring it to me. We will make the trade." "You come to us," Levi countered. "Alone." Matheson's face darkened. "That is not how this works. Boone, you are in no position to make demands." He gave a signal to his men, and they raised their rifles, the muzzles becoming three dark, unblinking eyes. "Bring me the book, or we will take it from your corpses." This was it. The moment stretched thin, a fragile skin of time that was about to break. Levi slowly began to dismount. "Stay on the horse," he murmured to Clara. "If it starts, ride hard and do not look back." "No," she whispered back fiercely. "I stay." As Levi's feet touched the ground, one of Matheson's men grew impatient. He shifted his aim slightly, centering his rifle not on Levi, but on Clara. It was a subtle, menacing movement, a threat to the person he knew Levi was protecting. Levi saw it. The world seemed to slow down. He saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. He did not think. He did not plan. He reacted. He lunged toward Clara, his body a shield, his arm outstretched to shove her and the horse away. The rifle cracked, the sound impossibly loud in the enclosed canyon. Clara felt a violent shove, and then she saw Levi's body jolt. A brutal, unnatural movement. A dark stain blossomed on his side, high on his ribs. He grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and his legs buckled. He fell to his knees in the dust, his face a mask of shock and agony. Time, which had slowed to a crawl, now exploded. Matheson laughed. "Fool!" he bellowed. "Now, the book!" Something inside Clara broke. The fear, the grief, the years of silent suffering, all of it shattered, and in its place was a core of pure, cold rage. She saw not Matheson, not his men. She saw her stepfather's leering face. She saw the flames that had consumed Ephraim's family. She saw the smoldering ruins of the barn. She saw the man she loved bleeding in the dust at her feet. She slid off the horse, drawing Levi's revolver from her hip as she moved. The gun felt like a natural extension of her arm. She raised it with both hands, the world narrowing to the space between the hammer and the sight. Matheson was still laughing, overconfident, his attention on the fallen Levi. She aimed for the center of his chest, and she pulled the trigger. The recoil was a solid punch to her wrists. The shot was deafening. Matheson's laugh cut off in a wet gurgle. A look of profound, stupid surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the dark hole that had appeared in his fine coat, then back up at her. He swayed in the saddle for a moment, then crashed heavily to the ground. The other two men, stunned, swung their rifles toward her, but before they could fire, a second shot echoed from the canyon mouth behind them. One of the men cried out and fell, clutching his leg. Sheriff Hart, a shotgun in his hands, stood beside his horse at the entrance to the canyon. He had followed them. The last standing man, seeing his employer dead and the sheriff behind him, threw his rifle to the ground and raised his hands in surrender. But Clara saw none of it. The world had shrunk to the space of a few square feet of bloodied dust. She ran to Levi, falling to her knees beside him. He was lying on his side, his face pale, his breathing shallow and ragged. Blood was soaking through his shirt, a terrifyingly large amount. She pulled him close, gathering his head into her lap. She smoothed the damp, dusty hair back from his forehead, her hands trembling. All the words she had kept locked away, all the truth she had been too afraid to speak, came pouring out of her in a desperate, broken whisper. "I love you," she wept, her tears falling onto his face, mixing with the dust and the blood. "Levi, please, please do not leave me. You promised you would stay. Stay with me. I love you." She pressed her face to his, whispering it over and over, a litany against the encroaching silence. His eyes flickered open. He looked up at her, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. He tried to speak, but only a soft sigh escaped. His eyes drifted closed again. Sheriff Hart arrested the two surviving men, his face grim. He helped Clara get Levi onto a makeshift travois, and they began the long, slow journey back to the shack, a funereal procession under the indifferent blue sky. The weeks that followed were a blur of fear and exhaustion. The bullet had passed clean through, but it had taken a piece of him with it. He hovered in a gray twilight between life and death, his body burning with fever. Clara refused to leave his side. She became a fierce, relentless guardian of his life. She cleaned the wound, boiled herbs for tea, and forced broth between his lips. She sat by his bunk through the long nights, her hand on his chest, feeling for the fragile, fluttering beat of his heart. She talked to him constantly, her voice low and steady, telling him about the rains that had finally come, about the green shoots in her garden, about the new home they would build. She was willing him to live, tethering him to the world with the sheer force of her love. Slowly, miraculously, he began to heal. The fever broke, and the color began to return to his face. He started to take solid food, and one day, he was able to sit up on his own, his body thin and weak, but his eyes clear. During that time, something in the town began to shift. The story of the gunfight in the canyon had become legend. The woman they had called a witch, they now spoke of in hushed, awed tones. She was the one who had faced down Matheson, the one who had brought down a tyrant. She was no longer cursed. She was a woman who had stood through fire and had not burned. When Clara rode into town for medicine, people no longer spat in her path. They nodded, their eyes filled with a new, grudging respect. Mrs. Kilgore saw her in the street and gave a curt, formal nod, an admission of a battle lost and won. As Levi regained his strength, they began to make plans. They used the money from the railroad, not to flee, but to build. They traveled back to Ephraim Coulter's land, to the hidden valley with its charred ruins and its lonely grave. Together, they cleared the blackened timbers. They laid a new foundation, using stones from the river that ran through the valley. Levi, his movement still slow and deliberate, taught her how to hew logs and raise walls. They worked from sunrise to sunset, the clean, rhythmic sounds of their labor replacing the ghosts of the past. They were not just building a cabin. They were building a life, a future, piece by painstaking piece. One night, after a long day of work, they lay together on a pallet before the fire in their half-finished home. A roof was over their heads, and the autumn wind blew outside, a wild but distant song. They were scarred, both of them, inside and out. They were weary from a battle that had taken almost everything from them. But in the quiet warmth of the firelight, they were filled with a deep, unspoken gratitude. Levi reached out and took her hands in his. Her palms were calloused now, her fingers strong from the hard work. He turned them over and kissed them, one by one. He looked at her, his pale eyes full of a love that needed no words. "I stayed," he murmured, his voice a low, soft rumble. Clara smiled, a true, gentle smile that reached her eyes. She brought his hand to her lips and kissed his scarred knuckles. "And I will stay," she answered, her own voice a vow, absolute and eternal. "Even if the whole world burns." The firelight flickered, casting their shadows on the new, raw timber of the walls. Outside, the wind blew across the wild, dark hills of Wyoming, a land that was hard, unforgiving, and unrelenting, but somehow, together, survivable. Thank you for joining us around the campfire. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to our Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.